direct or indirect? Do I show intent right off the bat, or do I go indirect and try to go under the radar? Now, both of these are correct from their partial point of view, but if you take these to their logical extreme, they become useless. Like what is the logical extreme? On the one end, the guy just does nothing. On the other end of the spectrum, it's what? They roll up. What's that mouth do? What that mouth do? So at the extreme, they become useless. Yes.
Could you make the case that one will yield results more often than the other?
If you were going to give me those two guys, the easier one to coach would likely be what that mouth do, because I can tell him to dial it back, because his energy system is probably quite free, whereas the meek guy that does nothing and thinks the indirect approach is better, it's going to be more difficult likely to remove those blocks. Now, in the case of what that mouth do, if he's doing that because he's like a psychopath, or like on some sort of neuroatypical spectrum, or schizophrenic or something where it's like a serious problem, then that's going to be its own difficulty. But if it's just a guy who's got a little too much energy, it can be easier for him to dial back, right? But again, there's two kinds of problems. There's convergent and divergent problems. So with a convergent problem, there's a single answer to it, right? 2 + 2 is 4, right? That's a convergent problem. Divergent problems yield contradictory answers, and the more that they're logically analyzed and studied, the more the answers diverge. These divergent problems, it's never really a problem because it's alive. It's a process. There's a vast range of choices that you have between what that mouth do and do nothing, okay? So some of those answers you might prefer, but there's no correct final answer. The most useful response to a divergent problem is to call sort of a higher energy into play. So some people, you'll note, they manage this polarity of direct indirect, they manage it with a minimum of intellectual effort. You know, they're not really thinking about it. They both show intent, and they're also nonchalant about it. They don't put pressure on them. Like they show intent, but it's also very meh. Again, Max used to call this the hot guy blasé. You'll note all good guys actually have this. They move things forward, but they also seem like kind of meh. Like they could leave at any moment and not even care, right? They have a synthesis, they blend it. So opening to this kind of higher energy principle of it's not A or B, Owen would call this thinking in nuance and gray areas. Opening to the idea of that allows us to transcend, integrate, and draw fully on the potential synergy of the lower parts. So what I want to talk here about now is a series of opposites that are going to form principles for charismatic expression. And coincidentally, they all begin with the letter P. Purpose, process, practice, play, persistence, presence, and potential. First principle here is our purpose. Now this is probably the most important one. So on the ends of the spectrum of purpose, at one end you have 0 goals, aimless. On the other end, you have this overly intense focus on partial goals that can distract from the path towards integration and wholeness. The higher energy principle of purpose does what? It reminds you that you're not a product or a goal, right? You're a process. Purpose is sort of a continuing sense of direction rather than a goal along the path, and it guides us from a larger perspective. So what are some examples of goals? Getting a better job.
Making $1 million.
Yeah, making money. Getting laid. If these things are mistaken for purpose, it can seriously interfere with your overall process. The thing about goals is this: once you achieve them, what happens? Now what? There's 2 ways to go insane. The first is to not have what you want. The second is to get what you want. Be happy from where you are, and then these goals are extra. And the purpose is overarching. Purpose is individual. My purpose is quite simple. It's to understand more clearly and in greater depth how this whole human energy system functions, and to explore the capacity of that system for the fullest, most whole kind of charismatic expression and social interaction, and in doing so, come to a better knowledge and understanding of myself. So in that context, every boot camp I do, every one of these seminars that I run, every student, regardless of their skill level, good or bad, every interaction I have when I'm out there meeting people, no matter the outcome of that, is an opportunity to fulfill that purpose. The purposes of this program that I've developed are, number one, to open and sustain charismatic expression with increasing consistency. Number 2, to fulfill your expressive potential. And then finally, create exercise process to serve as a vehicle for that journey. Okay? And that trio of purposes will fulfill many goals along the way, and you can choose to focus on any of those little goals that you have along the way as a supplemental purpose, but a larger whole purpose makes it more likely that these smaller goals will be actually realized along the way, along with many others that you might not even considered. And all of this stuff will be accomplished in proportion to your acceptance of yourself as a process, which is the second principle. What are the ranges of process? You have the status quo versus perfectionism. Do you lean more towards perfectionism, or do you lean more towards status quo? Because both of those are bad. Both of them are bad, right? How is perfectionism bad? Compared to that standard of perfection, anything that you do is going to suffer, right? Anything that you have done will suffer. So again, both of those can be positive though. On the one hand, status quoism, it's an acceptance of where you are right now. You know, like it's cool to be at this level right now. It's fine. It's part of the process. And then perfectionism, it can kind of motivate you to actually change and improve. So both of these can be good. But process orientation is directed towards actually experiencing life. Person is a process, not a product. A bad interaction can make it seem like you're a product, but that evaluation is just a measure of somebody's response to how your process is at that moment. You got to understand that. Acceptance of that expands our expressive power. If you're over concerned with the result of your communication in the moment, you're judging what you just said. And so what happens? You lose energy in the present. Or you're pre-evaluating your next move, which also saps energy from the present. You don't want to be wasting energy on future product, but conversely, with no end result in mind, the present process isn't going to be energized either. What are some results in field that might energize that process? Wanting to close the deal. The business deal, wanting internally to go home with that person. That's going to energize that process. But I say with this spectrum, the error is usually on the side of perfectionism. You know, it's usually on overstress of result and judgment. Now the third one is practice. Now this spectrum we have on one side, we got what? We've got procrastination, and on the other side we got what? Workaholic. Procrastination versus workaholic. The guy that doesn't want to go out versus the guy that's 7 nights a week, 100% of the time, it's never enough. Procrastination wants to find something more important to do so they can avoid it. From one point of view though, you're always practicing this stuff because you're always expressing. So practice is a process that's always available to us, interdependent on our awareness and use of it. So I want you guys to be able to go out and practice meaningfully. Okay, that's a big distinction. Meaningful practice and this is important as well, without dependence on an authority figure. Boot camp's an interesting thing because on the one hand, you know, at the very beginning I'm like, welcome to boot camp. There's a reason we call it boot camp as opposed to summer camp for little bitches. Why? Because we wanted to stress that military connotation. It's hard, you know, you're going to be pushed. But then on the second day, I'll usually say something like, look, tonight, I just want you to do whatever you want. I'll suggest things, I'll guide you. But if some part of you viscerally doesn't want to do an exercise or an approach that I suggest, just don't do it. Why? Because this is your process, it's not mine. And after tomorrow, I'm not going to be here. So I need you to do whatever you want and understand that those choices are just going to increase your awareness and expand your range of choice, your field of choice potential going forward. So the challenge is to find a way of overcoming your conditioned resistance to practice, which is usually simply a resistance to judgment. Those who find a way to remove that judgment, they end up finding the practice fun. And it should be. This brings us to the fourth, which is play, okay? Irresponsibility versus hyper seriousness. So on the one hand, we have a frivolous use of energy versus this overly irresponsible, super serious dude. So on the one end, it allows us to let go of the future. It allows us to let go of the past. It allows us to let go of results. But the other end keeps us intent on our goals. There's a book called Finite and Infinite Games by James Cars. And he says this, here's a quote: "A finite game is played for the purpose of winning, an infinite game for the purpose of continuing the play." Infinite players regard wins and losses in whatever finite games they play as just moments in continuing play. In any artistic endeavor, there arrives a point where you lose the initial sense of adventurousness, right? Like think of a kid, a little kid, he's painting. He has like finger paints. He's like, yay, duh. He's just like this abstract nonsense. This kid gets older. Now he wants to be an artist. He goes to school for it. Conformity sets in. The play becomes subject to rules, style, balance, composition. Very few children going through that process will recover that gift of original expression. And if they do so only after attaining mastery of conscious technique. So again, there's got to be a point where you're going out, you're a kid, you're just going out and interacting. Then there comes a point where you need to learn the rules. And let's face it, there are nuts and bolts mechanical rules to this stuff. But again, you've got to learn to become innovative again after that and learn to break the rules. This time not naively, but this time with full awareness of doing so. Fifth principle, persistence. And on this spectrum we have on the one end, detachment, and on the other end we have what? Determination. Determination can lead to forcing things, which screws it up, right? Over control. But it can be useful when it's blended with that detachment from the outcome. It's useful to remember one thing. You got your whole life to get good at this, and the growth is going to be in direct proportion to your capacity to persist. So what does that mean? It means being consistent. It means not being a weekend warrior, right? Like going out. How many in here think you can get better going out one day a week? Or going to the gym one day a week? Let's face it, it's probably better than nothing, but you're not going to see a whole lot of dramatic improvement. On the other hand, you don't necessarily want to be trying to make it happen all at once. Like Owen talked about going out 7 nights a week for 4 years. Don't just go out once a week. Don't try to make it happen all at once. How many in here think that they're in a plateau right now? Plateaus, understand though, they're periods of stabilization because change is happening whether you realize it or not. It's always happening, right? Persistence transforms those plateaus into ongoing growth. All right? So sixth guiding principle here is presence. And here are the opposites. We have what? Passivity, inertia versus what? Panic. Panic for the future. So over-intent goals, focusing over intently on goals can make us impatient and can actually interfere with reaching the goal. For example, I wrote a book, right? Anyone here read my book? Show of hands, couple, oh wow, surprising, more than usual. I usually don't expect people to read it. I know we have a saying in this country. How does it go? Oh yeah, reading is for faggots. But for those of you who have read it, that's great, thank you. But when I was writing that book, I essentially had a lot of raw material. I had 1,300 pages of raw material. And I had to somehow compile this and organize it into a coherent narrative. And as I would do this, I had to edit it and I had to write it and da-da-da-da. And so I noted that I was doing and I had kind of an idea, I had a structure and I kind of knew how many pages it would end up. And I noticed I was doing a certain number of pages per day. So I would sit there and I would, with a calculator, and I would calculate how long it was going to take me to finish. And I would do these different calculations. I said, well, if I do this, it would be that. I probably spent more fucking time making those damn calculations than writing the book on some days. And if I would have just shut the fuck up and sat down and wrote it, I would have got it done much, much more quickly than sitting there and again, when's the goal, when's the goal, when's the goal? It's kind of funny actually in retrospect. And even what I was doing, I knew I was doing it. So sometimes we're aware of these tendencies. By putting energy into that imagined future or the dead past, again, you're sapping energy from the present moment. Your problems with expression would absolutely disappear if you could just love and accept yourself in the moment. Why? Because then you're removing that judgmentalism. So much of this is about removing judgmentalism. But now here's the thing, the question arises, how can you like yourself now if you're trying to be better? Well, the answer is simple. You'll be motivated to accept yourself now if you realize that your progress and improvement is in direct proportion to your capacity for love and self-acceptance now. By the way, being present doesn't mean not learning from the past or being unable to plan for the future. I know people like this. They're very present, but they're stuck in this loop of behavior, right? They can't learn, they can't plan. Very present. But again, remember, you do have the capacity to remember and imagine, and these can be used positively. Discern, but don't judge. So this brings us to the last one, which is potential. On the one hand, you have underestimating your ability to improve. Underestimation. What's on the other end? Like fucking delusions of grandeur. As with any of these dualities, both ends can be useful. There's a principle here of infinite potential that integrates both ends of this spectrum, right? You have infinite potential. Now, what does that mean? You can always get better than where you are right now. Your potential is always greater than you think it is. Everyone in this room has the potential to communicate powerfully, charismatically.